We know that Reagan really didn't respond to AIDS during the first 5 or 6 years of his administration, even though in 1981 scientific evidence came out that we had an epidemic on our hands. Reagan really didn't allocate resources to the medical research in this epidemic, and really hasn't done too much until recently. He now has his testing programs, but he's never really responded to it as a medical problem. Is there any evidence that the CIA or some Reaganites might be involved in the origin of AIDS that first didn't really appear until around 1981? Is this the sort of virus that can be concocted by chemicals or some sort of biological warfare techniques?
Well, there are articles have been written by doctors saying that this thing smells of a man-made virus, and mentioning this Fort Detrick, where so many experimentations have been done in devising biological warfare, the diseases that can be controlled, can be used on society. No evidence has come out, nothing that can be cited as proof, and so we can only raise the question. And I have the feeling that if there is evidence somewhere, if there was, it's been destroyed. Another suggestion, not CIA, and mind you, in the context, the Fort Detrick experimentation, in the context of the MK Ultra program of experimenting on the American people with disease and drugs in over 200 medical schools and mental hospitals, a big program that went on a long time, supposedly closed down
by the CIA.
By the CIA. Also the Army was involved, but a lot of the Navy's activities, the Navy was just cover for the CIA. But experimenting on population centers with whooping cough viruses, with other kinds of viruses, dragging a barge through San Francisco Bay, leaking a flu-type virus to measure that technique for crippling a city. Apparently using swine fever virus, which is very much AIDS similar, to wipe out the hog population in Cuba in 1961. You know, you add these things up and we have every reason to ask if this is not either a deliberate or an experiment or testing or something that's gone awry done by the CIA. Another possibility, the London Times on the 11th of May had an article sourcing a high official in the World Health Organization who claims that they had he brought out documentation apparently that AIDS was triggered by smallpox inoculation programs of the World Health Organization, and presenting all kinds of massive documentation of the countries where it's hit the worst, where they had the massive smallpox inoculations. And then, of course, once it, apparently takes on a life of its own, the history will have to judge some of these things. Horrifying as AIDS is, it primarily the victims, the 25,000 who've died in this country so far, are homosexuals and drug users, the needle exchange. Horrifying as this is, nevertheless, it's limited to one segment of the society, and it's a drop in the bucket compared to some of our major health problems. 800,000 people die each year from smoking-related illnesses, and there is no great furor about that, and that's 800,000 per year. 55,000 a year dying on the highways, a lot of them from drunken driving, accidents and problems, and there's no big furor about that.
And millions of cancer, cancer, which is also, at least to some extent, human-made or produced medical problem.
From the pollution of the environment.
From pollutions and additives and preservatives.
And the furor on AIDS, it seems, it's clearly... Now, of course, the argument is that, well, it's potential for growth. There's 75 million people that have it in Africa today, and like numbers here, and there'll be 10 or 15 million now. History will show us whether or not that's true, whether it spreads like that.
Well, do these articles you're talking about, do they discount the stories that AIDS started in Africa and has spread to the rest of the world?
Well, the stories that I've read indicate that Africa and Haiti were the first places where epidemics of AIDS were found, and then the male homosexual and drug using population of the U.S. So the speculation is that if it was the product of some berserk experiment or some accidental thing like a smallpox vaccination program going berserk, it was then imported to the target population of gay men in the U.S. by someone who wanted to carry out a vendetta against them.
Well,
this is the speculation.
That charge was raised by TASS, for example, in 1983, and some of the more extreme magazines here in the States brought it up, and that struck me as cheap shot stuff. For one thing, the CIA simply was not uptight about homosexuality. The FBI was, because Hoover was a closet homosexual of the kind that would roll other homosexuals, persecuted other homosexuals, and the FBI, he had it very uptight about its homosexuality. The CIA just simply wasn't a big factor, and certainly not enough for the CIA to become, to launch a complicated, perhaps uncontrollable program to exterminate gays.
What about renegade factions of either the CIA or the State Department who heard that there was some virus that was used in some sort of chemical warfare that had been tested in Africa and was found in Haiti and found to be highly effective, and some renegades got their hands on this and used it as a sort of berserk vendetta? Is there any plausibility in this kind of scenario?
I have grave problems with it in the CIA and the State Department, although, if a renegade faction could be 2 or 3 individuals, who knows. The segment of society that has delighted the most, of course, is Nixon's moral majority, the Jerry Falwell, it's clearly God's punishment.
Right.
And, whether they would have had someone who could have brought out a disease, this is pure speculation. And I must say, of the kind that does not draw me so much, because we have so much. I mean, you have to keep your mind open to possibilities like that, because so much stuff has come out where we were saying, nah, it couldn't be, or not likely, and then later on you find absolutely they were doing it, the experimentation on population centers. I remember when I saw the movie Coma back in, I think it was the early 60s, and it kind of irritated me. Such fantasy, such nonsense. Someone goes into a hospital and they wind up in a ward down in the basement, and they're kept on drugs and experimented with disease, and they finally escape. And it never happened in this country, maybe in Hitler's Germany or something. And then I find out the MK-Ultra thing, that exactly that was done in over 200 medical schools and mental hospitals.
What is MK-Ultra? I don't recall that.
That was the program, the CIA's program for under the Technical Services Division, to experiment on population centers with disease and drugs.
And what years was this?
It started in the 50s and lasted until the 70s, when Jack Anderson began to expose it, and then the media caught onto it and the Congress investigated, and the CIA, by the way, destroyed thousands of files of victims, people that had experimented upon, so they could never get their files and sue. And supposedly it was stopped, except it was such a broad program that there was never any one bill that said stop this. It was just that the exposure made everybody presume that the thing would be stopped. And you have to be very troubled and very skeptical. Not one person was punished. Not one person involved lost a paycheck or was censored or was fired or much less jailed for those, for the experimentation on American citizens with disease and drugs.
In the meanwhile, I ain't going to share my needle with you anymore, boy.
Yeah. No, the needle usage and homosexuality is clearly, that's not a fantasy. That's not a myth. That's something where gays should take every precaution, and drug users are just inviting self-destruction by using the needles. And there's so many questions about this thing that I would advocate caution, but I would also, you know, very much like to get inside Fort Detrick's files and see what evidence there might be.